Hi, my name is Athaya Clarissa. I'm 14 years of age and I go to Al 3 High School. Today, I'll be talking about protecting the rights and justifying exploitation of Indigenous communities in developing economies. Indigenous people to this day are still one of the most poorly treated communities, and many are still taking them for granted. They own about 50 to 60% of the land on this planet, but governments, most especially in the West, only acknowledge 10% of this land being belonged to those Indigenous communities. So, who are these Indigenous people exactly? Indigenous people live and come from different continents of the world, from Arctic to the Pacific. According to the international law and policy, there is no authoritative definition to Indigenous people. Even the Indigenous Declaration does not set out a definition. That being said, there are three distinct groups that make up the term Indigenous: First Nations, Inuit, and Métis. Before the arrival of Western invaders, these Indigenous communities, especially in areas where it is more heavily populated with Indigenous people, still maintain cultural and political characteristics. Despite owning more than half the land on this planet, these communities still face threats to their culture and rejection of protection. The current economic globalization has resulted in corporations and businesses take act on more bigger and massive projects. Companies have increased mining for fossil fuels and mineral resources, which has led them to looking into more vulnerable and remote regions of the planet, which is where these Indigenous communities mostly live. The revenue from these mining projects is immense and can be used to resolve some of the top problems the world faces, such as poverty, hunger, and better education for third world countries. But instead, the money profited from these acts are continually used to fund corruption and sometimes to even more or less attack these Indigenous people. Huge companies are not only exploiting these Indigenous people for their land, but also for their hard work and effort too. One example that a lot of people might be familiar with is the case of Kylie Jenner. Model and businesswoman has come under fire after she was reportedly refusing to pay the Bangladesh workers who work in her factory for her clothing line. After getting caught doing this heartless act, she, along with her company, still then had the audacity to fire these Bangladesh workers without paying them a penny. However, let's look at a case more closer to home. As reported by the World Rainforest Movement Organization, the international demand for palm oil has led to a sprouting oil palm plantation in Indonesia. The land availability and cheap labor surely makes this act a lot easier. Women has turned into cheap labor with mediocre to little protection and safety as the palm oil plantation expands. To this day, there are about 16.1 million hectares of oil palm plantation in Indonesia, and there are still plans to expand the area by about 20 million hectares, covering the land of Sumatra, Kalimantan, Sulawesi, Maluku, and Papua. This tremendous growth of oil palm plantations is supported by two key factors, the first being low-wage labor, and the second, the ease of obtaining land. Oil palm plantations have turned women to cheap labor for plantation companies, which disrupts the livelihood of these once food producers, then leading them to often having little to no choice but to accept working as plantation laborers. A notable difference, however, has been shown in setting a standard for Indigenous rights according to the United Nations organizations. Lands, territories, and resources have collectively been acknowledged and accepted as to it being belonging to these Indigenous communities. Although many countries have recognized those rights to it being belong to the Indigenous community, some states as of now still have not recognized and ensured the rights of the Indigenous. Well, what can we do to ensure that this world is a safe place for those Indigenous communities? Well, according to the WRI Indonesia organization, we can, number one, secure indigenous and community lands. Those who have power should reform the law and take other necessary actions to ensure the rights of the indigenous. Number two, make tenure security, indigenous and community lands a strategy for central climate change mitigation. Financing and securing indigenous lands would certainly not harm the pockets of the people and would even reduce emissions. Lastly, the third point would be utilizing governmental funds to secure indigenous lands. This one is pretty self-explanatory. The funds from the government should be used to protect and secure indigenous lands and rights as well. In accordance with the United Nations organizations, UNICEF, or United Nations Children's Fund, has created an agenda that reinforces a foundation of human rights in hoping that it'll favor the rights of the indigenous. The World Health Organization has also been promoting the health of the indigenous globally and has also offered a number of resolutions in support of the health of the indigenous. Ms. Roy Henriksen explains that as the world is moving forward towards 2030, hope is growing to recognize indigenous communities for their priorities, concerns, and rights. She claims the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development has given indigenous people a certain level of expectation, as reported by the United Nations organization. To deny people their human rights is to challenge their very humanity, as quoted by Nelson Mandela. Thank you.